Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. Learning recovery programs are shrinking and even disappearing from many North Carolina schools. That's because temporary federal money that funded them is gone. Remote schooling during the COVID-19 pandemic slowed student learning, and schools credit programs funded with the stimulus dollars for helping students catch up. WRAL Education Insider Emily Walkenhost has been digging into what schools are doing now that the extra money's gone. Emily, good to see you again.
Glad to be here.
Emily, the pandemic threw education into upheaval. Remind the non-parents listening what that looked like.
So that looked like quite a lot. So I'll try to keep it brief. Essentially, students were all moved to remote learning, learning on laptops if they even had a laptop. School kind of didn't always happen very much or very smoothly for students for quite some time, especially in the spring of 2020. And slowly but surely, students got back into school back in 2021. But they went, a lot of older students especially went, all of the 2020-2021 school year without being in person in school every day.
And then the federal government sort of stepped in with this cash. How much money are we talking, and what were schools spending on as it relates to COVID-19?
So there were a few stimulus packages, and for the most part, they didn't really have any restrictions on them. It ended up totaling about $6.2 billion just for North Carolina schools alone. Those schools may have gotten, cash here or there from like a governor's fund or their local county commissioners or something, but generally $6.2 billion, not a lot attached to it. The thinking being, if we don't really have a lot of requirements on it, you can spend it a lot faster. So schools spent that on, first maybe like supplies, cleaning supplies, plexiglass, different COVID things. Laptops was a huge thing. They spent their money on it first. And then, programming is really what became more permanent, temporary, but lasting several school years.
That's right. And a big portion of that money was spent on learning recovery programs. Tell us about those programs.
So there were a lot of different approaches to this. That was tutoring. Kind of this intensive tutoring, we hear it as high dosage or high impact tutoring a lot. And basically that's just taking 1, 2, 3 students at a time for at least 30 minutes, like 3 days a week, and really drilling down into math or reading work that they need to be doing, kids who are really far behind. So not every kid may have gotten that, but some of those who were a lot farther behind have been getting that sort of intervention. We have intervention teachers, learning coaches, different people who might have served in more of a support role for other teachers, who might have also done some pullouts really similar to that intensive tutoring. New curriculum, staff development, just different training on different things, academic screening, maybe being able to buy some more tests that you can use to kind of screen kids for certain deficits, certain things, certain skills they haven't mastered in reading, that sort of thing.
And now they're facing this fiscal cliff. Tell us about that.
Right. So it was $6.2 billion that basically just had to be spent by September 30th of 2024. So just a couple of weeks ago. And that's it. This was one-time funding. And, I think the thinking was, maybe they won't need it past this date. If everybody catches up to where they were before, then, why would you need it past September 30th, 2024? It didn't really turn out that way.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear about what school systems are doing now that the federal stimulus dollars have gone away. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL Education Insider Emily Walkenhost about funding for learning recovery programs. Emily, remote learning put many students behind where they're supposed to be. Where are things now in terms of their performance?
In most subject areas, they're still behind. So the best way to really measure this on a bigger scale is to look at those standardized test scores, those tests students take every spring, to look at what percentage of students passed, maybe were even better than past career and college ready, what percentage of students really fell into those lower test scores. And basically what we know is that in a lot of tests, most tests, students are still not passing them at the same percentage. There have been some gains, some test scores have rebounded, and some school districts are really where you'll find this. So in Wake County, in a ton of subject areas, they actually have exceeded some of the pre-pandemic levels, but still behind in a couple. So, generally across the state, we're looking at still needing to make improvements, even though we have seen it in some places. But, when you think of the law of averages, if Wake County has made this, huge rebound, then that means some others might be still pretty far behind.
So now schools have to figure out how to catch up without that federal funding. What are they doing?
Right. So they've had to do a number of things. They had to kind of just take a look at, how much they were really spending on these programs. What is a realistic request we can actually make from our local county commissioners? So some might have looked at, so in Wake County, they looked at, we're spending all this money on school counselors, substitute teachers. These are things that really seem to help staff be more focused and supported across a lot of things. So Wake County said, we really need to keep some of these counselors because they're helping kids. We really need to keep these substitute teachers because it's keeping teachers focused on their own students if they don't have to cover other classes. And so they went to commissioners and asked for that. But what Wake County didn't do, and what many other school systems didn't do, is they didn't go to their county commissioners to keep intervention teachers. There's a number that was too big to ask commissioners to cover. We're talking $6.2 billion. That's a lot for a county. So even if Wake County, which has, a pretty supportive tax base, couldn't afford a lot of these things, we can imagine what happened in others. And we do know that in others, they cut a bunch of positions.
Well, yeah, that's right. You spoke with a number of school teachers and administrators. What did they tell you about the tough choices they're having to make?
They're having to kind of look at what was the most effective measure, what was the most effective thing that they did to meet a certain goal. So, it's not just about learning recovery. In some cases, in Franklin County, Franklin County did a couple of interesting things. Essentially, they realized their intervention teachers were really making a big difference for students. So they changed some of their librarian positions. They now have assistants running libraries, and they moved librarians into intervention teacher positions. So they just kind of shifted personnel around in a way that allowed them to keep about a dozen intervention teachers. Another thing they did is they really wanted to keep a longevity bonus that they had started to offer to their employees, which ranged from about $500 bonus for people with basically no experience to $4,500 for people with 26 or more years of experience. And they asked employees, hey, did this bonus keep you employed in our school district? Because, they neighbor Wake County, they neighbor other counties that are always competing against each other for, okay, well, this county raised their starting pay, so we have to raise our starting pay so that we don't lose anyone. And they felt that this longevity bonus, based on what they were hearing from employees and just their overall situation, is they had to keep it. So they went to commissioners and they asked for it and they got it.
I presume the retention bonuses are to keep teachers who have taken on more roles, right?
Right. So a lot of the federal funds went towards stipends, extended contracts. So if you decided to work during the summer for a summer learning program, you got paid an extra amount for that. There were other stipends for different responsibilities. If maybe you served as a tutor after school, after teaching all day, different things like that. There were a lot of federal funds for that.
So are there other revenue sources that these school systems can tap into beyond just asking their county commissioners for more money?
Right. So it's not, necessarily that they can't use existing funding. It's more of a consideration for, well, if we take money we already have, that means we have to cut something else. So, by law, a lot of funding sources actually do have restrictions on them. You can only use this funding source for these purposes. But in the case of federal funding, you can use a funding source called Title I. Title I is a funding source that is geared toward schools with higher percentages of low-income students. So, there are a lot of schools that qualify for Title I funds. There are a lot of schools that don't. So you can use Title I funds. North Carolina gets like over $500 million every year in Title I funds. And you can say, okay, well, we're going to try to keep some of these intervention teachers with Title I funds. Only schools that have Title I can actually make that decision. And to make that decision, they might have to say, okay, well, this other thing we were doing with Title I, we have to cut that now. So, but it is a legal mechanism they can use. If you don't have Title I funds, you can look at maybe combining funding sources that don't have restrictions on them that would have you be limited. So if you have, okay, well, I can get 30% of my money from this fund and 30% from this fund and 40% from this other fund, and it's all legally permissible for me to use these dollars on intervention teachers, you could also do that. It requires a lot more creativity.
Now, researchers and state officials have been looking into which interventions were most effective. How will that research help if the systems don't have the money to fund any of these programs?
So, the value of this research is really going to be, figuring out what works and going forward. So is there anything, schools essentially had $6.2 billion to kind of experiment with. Now, obviously, a lot of that wasn't really an experiment. They had to buy laptops if they were going to do remote learning. There was a lot of stuff they just had to pay for with that money that was not really a creative experiment. But with other things, they're like, hey, research says that intensive tutoring is going to make a big difference. Let's see if we can make that work in our school district. Let's see if we can make a big impact with intervention teachers. And so essentially you have, this scenario in which schools are trying these new things. And if they work, maybe that guides future policy later on. So no, they don't have these dollars anymore. But maybe this is something school boards can use when looking at their local funds, which are relatively limited. Maybe this is something state lawmakers can look at, thinking, okay, well, maybe we have too many restrictions on our funding sources, and maybe schools would benefit from more flexibility so that instead of having to carefully take from this or that funding source and combine them, maybe there's an easier way to make sure that schools can make the decision to have intervention teachers if the research bears out that they had a sufficient return on investment.
Now, I presume that at some point, kids will be all caught up, with or without the federal funding. Is there any sense of when that might be?
So the line on that has always been years. So Superintendent Catherine Truitt and her team has been saying since very early on, she only took office in January of 2021, but something her team has been saying for years now was, 4 to 5 years is really the hope. And obviously we are about 4.5 years removed from schools initially closing.
Well, we know you'll be watching as that progresses. Thanks, Emily. That's WRAL Education Insider Emily Walkenhost for her reporting on learning recovery funds. Go to the education section of WRAL.com. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.